Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Dave. I'm a parent of a daughter in college, and we live in Chicago, Illinois.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a graduate of the University of Georgia, and she is getting her master's degree at North Carolina State University. This week in the news, Matt Bonser, the director of admissions at Colorado College, and I continue our conversation about demonstrated interest and predictive modeling. Question from Kristen from California. And she wants to know, how can my student find a liberal arts college that is not intolerant to her center-right political beliefs? Very important question, and Lisa and I take it up. A brand new interview I did with Akil Bello, and we look at tough questions about test scores, and it's a 4-parter. And I'll tell you, you think I didn't bite my tongue now? Akil Bello doesn't bite his tongue in that interview. And for our spotlight, Lisa tells us about her trip to McGill in Montreal as we go international for our college spotlight. Friends, hopefully you enjoyed the first part of my conversation with the director of admissions, Matt Bonser, at Colorado College, as we discuss about 15 to 17 ways students often attempt to demonstrate interest. And Matt rates them from 1 to 10, his own personal opinion, as to how much weight these different methods are accorded by at least his experience. We finished that up today, and then we transition into talking about predictive modeling and different ways in which predictive modeling is assessed. Listen and enjoy. What about a student emails the regional admission officer and asks some great questions in the email?
Yeah, maybe a 2. Mm-hmm. It's good engagement, doesn't cost much on the part of the student, to the extent that those are sincere questions that are hard to answer otherwise. So I guess maybe that's my caveat in terms of demonstrated interest is, there's a difference between somebody reaching out to me and saying, how's your biology program?
Sure. From
that to, I dug into the biology program. I'm really interested in this. Could you do a virtual introduction for me to this bio professor who I think might be a, good match for my interests? Or, I've been on the Career Center site. I'm really interested in the pre-med program. Can you help me understand how tied this is into a major versus is it a freestanding advisory program? Does everybody who say that they're pre-med get in, or is there a minimum GPA requirement? That's not always super clear on the website. And so there's a difference there when those students are asking questions that are hard to answer otherwise. Those are great engagements, really show to a territory rep, oh, I've dug into this. And I've done my due diligence already. I think when it's those super perfunctory kinds of conversations, it's like, I'm just going to send you a link. May not make much of an impression, good or bad, frankly, when it's just, I know this is out on the website. I'm going to find it, send it your way. And then maybe we have some follow-ups thereafter.
I love it. And I really love how you're capturing nuance here. This is great. Web traffic. Let's talk about web traffic. We know that schools have ability to see web traffic, and so that could be a lot. It could be a lot of web traffic, or maybe web traffic to certain parts of the website that maybe you've even done internal studies that people that, they're looking at a lot of enrollment stuff on here, or that's starting to move in the predictive analytics side. But talk to me about a student's web traffic and what it may or may not connote in DI in this context.
Right. I think this is a particularly challenging one because you're right that Slate does track traffic to the extent that it can off of our website. It's a really easy step in Safari or Chrome to set up private browsing or an incognito window. And so you can't prove that that student wasn't on the website. Again, this is where I might come back to the college-specific essay question and say, well, we don't have evidence that they were on the web, but they answered this essay question so thoroughly that we believe they've done research. However, they ended up doing it. So it's hard to prove that negative. I think it's also fraught because this is, frankly, pretty dangerous information. As much as it's on our website, I think about, those students who are spending a lot of time understanding financial aid on those financial aid pages. What does that tell us about their likelihood then to apply for aid, whether we're need aware, which we are, or need blind? Are we revealing information about that student's college search that we probably don't want to officially consider in our review process? I think about that for students who wisely are looking at accessibility resources. How do we work with students with physical differences or who have a 504, ADHD? Do we really want to know that in the admission process? Maybe not, and that can be used in negative ways. So I think this is one area where we're really careful to deal with this a little bit more in the aggregate and more toward predictive modeling, that we can see a student over a sustained period of time has engaged in multiple pages. That might tell us that a student has a degree of interest that is maybe more likely to apply or to enroll than others, but I think is relatively lightly used by us. So this is way down there for me. It's sort of like the email opens.
Well, this one might be even lower. What about following you on social media?
Again, like good thing to do, but it's almost like that you should load the regions that you're considering into your weather app as well to see like, hey, what's the weather like in Colorado Springs today? Do I need an umbrella? Because I think it can provide some good insight. We at least are not connecting that back into the admission world at all. So it's a 0 for us because we frankly just don't have a way to integrate that into our data, and it's going to depend on the school. Some schools will be a little bit more integrated than others. I might think about this from this could be a really interesting idea from a predictive modeling standpoint, especially at that admit stage when students are joining a class of Facebook page or they're joining our admitted student discussion on Discord. That actually could be predictive of students' likelihood to yield. Man, that's not something that we use, but maybe we should, at that scale. But that's an interesting one. We don't use it on the admission side, but I could see how that could be valuable at the macro. Yeah, 0.
Yeah.
0 for us.
Yeah. And what about a student adds you to the I'll throw these two out at the same time. Student adds you to their common app in the dashboard because you kind of get access. You kind of know when someone's done that, right? They've added you in their dashboard. And I'll ask two at one time. They have College Board ACT send you test scores. Mm-hmm. Talk about those two.
Right. So those are both things that we track. And so we're a common application and QuestBridge and coalition application school. In many of those cases, we're getting some advanced notification from those platforms that students might be interested in us. I guess I would say from a predictive standpoint, those students where we get a referral from Common App or we have a test score, knowing that students only have a handful of score sends before they have to start paying for it, those are, at the macro level, very predictive of the likelihood to apply, right? You've been on the application platform, you've added CC to the list and allowed us to communicate with you. Those are quite predictive, and yet, like from a demonstrated interest standpoint, don't matter. So I'm going to give it really like a 0 for demonstrated interest, even as those, I'm trying to think from a predictive model standpoint, those don't shake out in a predictive model either, unless it was the first time that a student has entered our database, right? When a student initiated action gets them a record in Slate, that's relatively predictive of their likelihood to apply. It doesn't really shake out
because you've
in a
moved from
yield model.
prospect to inquiry, just similar to if they go
Right.
on and request information on the website.
Exactly.
You've moved from prospect to inquiry and then admissions funnel.
Yeah, any of those things that take real work from a student, right? Filling out an inquiry form, showing up to that high school visit, showing up to a college fair. Those are all predictive because it took student labor to do them. Where, if you're on niche or CapEx or you've registered on Big Future or whatever, those do take work also, but that might be distributed out to a bunch of colleges at the same time. When they're doing work specific to CC, they've said, yes, I'm interested in this place. That's quite predictive at the macro level.
And somebody applies early action. So we know ED, we've talked about that already. That's the ultimate interest statement.
Yeah, EDs are 10, right?
We know that's the 10.
Yeah.
But what about they have a choice of doing EA or RD, but they do EA?
Well, and this is where things are often quite correlated with each other.
Mm-hmm. Especially with their predictive modeling, because you have time to work on yielding them more. And so it could.
Sure.
Yeah,
it gives us some time. But I would say, those students who are applying EA, especially at a school that does both ED and EA, they may be signaling that for some reason or another, which we don't know, they did not apply early decision to our institution. And that could be that they're in another ED pool, and it could be that there are other student and family priorities at play that mean that they don't have an ED choice, right? That's unknowable by us. But I think that where I see the correlation actually is often between the well-written college-specific essay and early action, right? Because as a school with both early action and regular action, those students who've at least applied EA are signaling, we think, that CC is relatively high up on their list, and they'd love to get an early response from us because they're excited to hear back, right? And so it's indicative that we might be among the top few or so on their list. And so, but I do see a correlation there between a well-written college-specific essay and early action, right? Those often go together. And so it's hard to pull those apart because EA on its own, like with a poorly written college-specific essay, is not worth all that much.
Right.
But man, we love EAs because we tend to see that enthusiasm throughout the file. So, on its own, it might only be like a 3, but because we tend to see that level of enthusiasm, a depth of understanding, a sense that students really want to be at our school, EA in its totality is probably up there, a 5 or so.
So what did I not ask you, Matt? I went through my list of things. The only other thing I thought of asking you was you find out somebody had more of a comprehensive visit. Like you found out they set up a meeting with a faculty member, or they arranged to sit in class, or they did something a little more than the traditional. Right. That's the only thing I thought of asking you. I didn't. But are there any other demonstrated interest points I didn't ask? You mentioned earlier that maybe a couple might have come to mind. So share what you're thinking.
I think there are 2 that come to my mind. First, I was glad you let me rate early decision as a 10.
Yes.
Because of course that one's right up there. But I would think about the demonstrated interest around athletic recruitment, and I realize that's maybe its own full podcast segment for you, and around legacy as well. It's not exactly tied to demonstrated interest, but I think there's something to get at there. Again, that might be its own.
It's funny. I had legacy in, but then my
Oh,
thinking was, what if there's legacy without all this other stuff? There's legacy
yeah, no,
without the
so
visit. There's legacy without the good call specific. So I ended up pulling it out of my list. But
exactly. Well, and I think it's sort of like the way we were talking about trying to untangle early action from other things. In the case of athletic recruitment, right, we have a sense from coaches that they're going to fill a particular institutional priority.
sure.
They've often engaged with coaches separate from a college fair, separate from a high school visit. They've seen them at a tournament. They've had phone calls that we're not all aware of. And yet that coach's perspective is important to us in understanding how they may participate in our college community. And so that is a very different form of demonstrated interest that matters a great deal. I think the legacy piece for us cuts both ways when you try to untangle it, because when it's legacy on its own, I think about my son and hopefully looking at Colorado College, there is a privilege there that at our dining room table, he has an opportunity to learn a great deal about CC, not just because I'm a staff member, but as an alum. And if he squanders that opportunity in his college-specific essay, man, I might judge that a bit more harshly, right? Because you had every
Sure.
opportunity to know a place and didn't take advantage of that. So I think that often goes in conjunction with other things, right? That's an access to an alum network, other kinds of insights around an institution that I feel like students really have to then do their best understanding that in context.
I'm really glad you brought athletics up because, I usually work with 7 to 9 athletes every year, let's say. They're not going through an athletic pre-read with 10 schools.
Right.
So it's a limited number of schools that they're going through that process. So you're already down to a small number. And then you're right. You're also getting coaches' feedback and much more insights about interaction. So I think that's actually a really, really good one. And thanks for sharing that. So one last question on this topic, and that has to do with, it's a question that we've gotten a few times. Like, how do schools actually track? Is it all contingent on the student using the same email address and it's all based on emails? Is it IP addresses? And then therefore, does it only apply to that one computer? And what if they're logged in on a different computer or their phone? So talk about that piece.
So here's how I understand it. And I'm not necessarily the technical expert, but just enough to be dangerous. My understanding is that the way it commonly works is that we will send an email, right? As we send many emails.
Sure.
And that's got a tracking pixel embedded in that. And so when a student opens an email, that is often kicking back an IP address that is stored in Slate. And so any future engagement via web browser that's using that same IP address will kick back into Slate as connected to that student. But that could be multiple devices, right? If you think about a scenario where the student has opened an email on their phone, maybe they've opened it on a tablet, and they've opened it on, the desktop computer in their living room, we would likely have all three of those IP addresses and would be able to track across all three devices. But you think about that, maybe the tablet is shared with a younger sibling. So how much of that can you really track back to an individual student? Not entirely. The family computer in the living room, well, that might be used by a parent to research financial aid and do the net price calculator. You can't necessarily tie it to the student per se, but you can tie it to a device that the student has access to. I think the real murky area that we see is around, if there were a computer that many students use in a college counseling office, I have no idea if that's getting connected to all of those students or none of those students. But it is a murky thing. So yes, we're capturing an IP address and multiple IP addresses in many cases. We also have to use that with caution that you don't really know that it's only that student's behavior.
Awesome. Well, let's turn our attention to predictive modeling. And you've already given us a definition earlier, but I want to share with you a conversation I had with another VP of enrollment and get your feedback. So it's a few months ago, and he was telling me there's a real debate amongst third-party, companies as to which model of predictive analytics is the best. He said there's the behavioral model, which really looks at a lot of those similar demonstrated interest criteria, and it could include other things like did you come back to a revisit or, how much portal activity you had, but it's looking at behaviors. And then he said there's the static model that's not really focusing on behaviors, but it's looking at things like what is your GPA? Obviously, it's hardest to yield the highest GPAs because they have the most options, right? What's the size of your need-based aid or merit scholarship? What's the distance from home? Where did your parents go to college? Where do kids in your zip code go to college? Kids in your high school go to college? And other factors. And this particular VP said they literally are hiring one person from each of these different camps this year after looking at 20 companies initially, narrowing it down to 6, and then sort of comparing the two. So do you have any thoughts of these two competing models? Is there one that you feel is more accurate than the other?
Well, I don't necessarily see them as competing, but rather as complementary, right? They both reveal a degree of insight as I guess I might start with that more static model, but I think to ignore the behavioral aspect, you're losing insight there. And again, I'm thinking about an entire potential admit pool here that, as we're thinking about a predictive model, we're looking at, all right, we've reviewed all of these cases. We're excited for them to come to our school. We're going to admit maybe overall about 3 times as many students as we've got room for on campus in classroom seats and in beds in residence halls. And I need some assurance that despite admitting 3 times as many students as I have room for, that I'm going to end up with one full class of students, right? So that's the baseline,
Sure.
is a level of control and predictability. And so I think you do a little bit of both. And I think that the behavioral aspects reveal themselves over time, right? So there's been some behavioral. If we think about like all of those things that we just talked about with demonstrated interest, we can look back through our data, to your point, of students from X number of miles away often yield at a higher rate or a lower rate, depending on proximity. Students who did not apply for need-based financial aid, those who did, how much did they qualify for, if they received a merit scholarship, and how much dollar value is that? Is there a legacy connection, right? Coming back to that legacy piece.
Sure.
Do we think that we've got a little bit better shot of yielding that legacy student than a non-legacy? So as you're thinking about where did parents go to college, or if they went to college, what does that reveal about their likely behavior? All of those things might be baked in before a student maybe ever applies, right? They're sort of demographic information to an extent. And yet, once a student is admitted, they may then reveal further information, because now, and I'm, again, thinking about the demonstrated interest thing, now they've emailed their territory representative with a really nuanced question about that biology department. And that may be indicative of, oh, the student is not just, happy for their admission offer, but they're digging in even deeper about CC. That email might be more predictive at the admit stage than it was as they were investigating colleges, because it's showing that they're doing further research. Certainly if a student is coming to campus for an admitted student open house program or a regional welcome party hosted by one of our alumni groups, those are showing a level of sincere engagement with that offer well before that May 1 deadline rolls around. And the student has to say yes or no, or ghost us, I suppose. And is helping us understand now that the student has an offer, if they're really tangling with that offer, shows that we've got a really good viable chance with them.
I like your answer because why can't it be both and? You know what I mean? If two camps have compelling case, it's probably because there's value in both sides of the argument. And so why not take the best of both? I think that makes a lot of sense. So there are a lot of third-party companies out there, and you know that.
Yep.
I mean, some of the big ones, EAB, Ruffalo Noah Levitt's, Human Capital, but there's just like dozens of them. And they charge a decent amount of money to say, hey, we can do this for you guys. And most of the schools that I talk to are working with an outside person just because, I mean, the consequences of under-enrollment and over-enrollment are so high, and predicting heads and beds for 17 and 18-year-olds isn't easy. And so what is it that I'm going to ask a two-part question. What is it that these companies are doing that you can't do yourself in-house? And I know some of them literally will give you a score, right? Like, this kid's got an 80% chance of coming. This kid's got a 15% chance of coming. Like, how accurate do you find them to be? So kind of a twofold. Why use these outside companies, and how accurate do you find they are?
Right. So for the first piece, I guess I would say we're really good at recruiting students, and often that's a one-to-one or one-to-few sort of scale. We're not so great, right? I don't have a degree in statistics to be able to dig into all that. Although I will say we do our own kind of in-house approach. I was about to call it informal. It's not informal, but it's maybe basic, and maybe a bit more on the demographic side of things to say, all right, knowing the basics as we do, here's what we think is going to happen. And that's sort of a single variable approach to yield. And yet it's so reassuring to have an outsider vouch, like, hey, what we're seeing is or is not what we see, because we have access to our own data of who we've admitted in prior years and how they've behaved. Whether that's a demographic or behavioral approach, we have access to our population, and those that we did choose to admit. We don't really know quite as much about those who we chose not to admit, right? So you lose some nuance there. I think what these companies can provide is a view across an entire market and say,
that's a good point. They're not so insular. They have the big picture because they work with so many different schools.
They have a bit bigger picture, and maybe in a more timely fashion, we will eventually have access to schools' common data set and IPED submissions, and we'll see in the aggregate what their admit rate was, yield rate. We'll sometimes get some insight around how many EDs they admitted and committed and so on. But it doesn't have a whole lot of depth there. And so there's some ability to share some intelligence around, okay, so we have another client in the Midwest, another liberal arts client. Here's what we're seeing of their application and admit trends. You know, we don't do a whole lot of merit, but here's what other schools are seeing that do merit. So that this may be a concern for you. They can provide a degree of insight that, as much as I love to call and chat with my colleagues, I'm not always going to get that from them.
Sure.
And so it is sort of the bigger data perspective. Since CC is a relatively small place, they can sort of aggregate that in some ways that's helpful to understanding, and then apply some of that other sorts of analysis after the fact, right? So we use human capital for our admitted student survey. So when students do say yes or no back to us, students are then completing a survey that's common among many schools that work with human capital, and they can say, ooh, we're seeing this trend in these responses across institutions that distance from home was more persuasive, or shifts in merit policy really persuaded students in this direction or another, that if we were doing our own survey and only sharing that with ourselves, we wouldn't quite get that
makes
insight.
sense. So it's both the broader access to the larger national landscape, and as you started out, we're not necessarily statistical analysis. I mean, there may be some expertise in data quants and all that stuff that they bring in as a specialty, just like you have admission specialty. So a combination of both, really. And how accurate do you find they are? Because some of the conversations I'm having with other people like you at other schools are telling me they're not as accurate as I'd like them to be. Like they can be off by 20% on, can be 20% swings either way. I mean, this is the kind of stuff I'm hearing.
Yeah, this is the challenge. And I don't want to place this at the feet of, consultants or in our own expertise, right? We are attempting to predict the behavior of often 17 and 18-year-olds. And in a relatively quickly shifting higher ed landscape, right? Emerging from a pandemic, I expected more change in geographic behavior, frankly, than we've seen, and a contraction in students' willingness to travel far from home. Right? I expected a change there, and it didn't happen quite as much as we thought it might. So sometimes we're predicting that the landscape is going to change more than it really does. Sometimes we come in with sort of a static model that it's going to be just like what happened in 22, and 23 is just different. Or Colorado College is just different. Yes, there's a margin of error there. And I think we're using them to try and mitigate that risk, but it's never going to be risk-free. That's why we all maintain waitlists to the extent that they're still useful for us after May 1 to try and fill in the nooks and crannies of our class to get it a little bit closer to target in whatever way we need, because that's both, I think about this, if the 20% difference, well, is that on the overall class size? Is that on financial aid expenditure? Is that in gender balance? Is that in the percent students of color or first gen or your target for Pell students? Whatever that might be, right? Our targets are complex and sometimes contradictory. And so you're not going to get all of those things right. Total headcount, really important that we get really darn close, but we also expect that the class is never going to be perfect on every single measure. It's a human process. And so they're going to help us get closer than we might do on our own. Gosh, I hope so, right? Like, we hope that they're bringing that expertise to bear, and that, the fear is if we weren't using them, would we be 30% off?
Sure.
I don't want to quote that number as
but the fact that most people keep using them indicates that, you don't keep doing things you're not seeing some value to. But yeah, what I'm hearing you say is that you recognize it's extremely difficult. There's a lot of variables that I don't expect precision, and nobody really, really should. And so,
and that it's, to go all the way back.
More schools, which even adds more, another variable.
And we don't know exactly how many,
sure,
right? But I'm thinking actually back to our conversation around ED and why yield in ED is not 100%. There's no variable for the student that you were referencing from the boarding school side of, what's the flag for
there was
father is going to be diagnosed with cancer and have 6 months to live. Like, well, that's really important for that student's decision to enroll or not. And yet that is not knowable in a model.
Yeah, well said. Matt, I don't want to cut into your lunch. You've been most generous with your time. Is there anything you wanna close us out with that you haven't shared that's on your mind to share?
No, I think we've covered some great ground. I'm interested in that sort of the connection between that demonstrated interest, right? What we often see at the individual student level, and what is it that I've got to do to make sure my applications stand out, versus the aggregation of all of those data points for us to try and wrap our heads around who's going to show up on our campus next August. So, I'm excited in 2 months' time for a new class to arrive on our campus, and hope that this shares some of the muddiness, that there isn't a perfect formula for how to stand out, and that some of those things that I might frankly rate relatively high, applying early decision or visiting, hopefully that those do come through with a degree of nuance of they're still not right for everybody, and that colleges will seek to understand that as much as possible, and that it can't just be a formula to say, oh, you've applied ED, you did the right thing. No, you've got to be able to do the right thing for you and your family and your search. So I hope that comes through.
Yeah, no, this was great. Our listeners listen because they want some depth. And I feel like this was like we really got into some of the weeds and the nitty gritty that it's just the kind of stuff our listeners like. If you're listening to a 2-hour podcast, you're a certain kind of listener.
Indeed, as one of those listeners, I concur.
Awesome. So I'll close out, friends. Matt and I have also been talking about him coming on and doing a deep dive on gap years. Colorado College is known nationally as a leader. You guys have the Gap Institute and a lot going on there. So you can look forward to hearing from Matt again as we really dive into the gap year conversation. But thanks so much, Matt.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
All right, Lisa, no small talk today. Let's just dive right in.
All right. This question is from Kristen from California.
Hi, Mark. My name is Kristen, and I am a resident of California and also am the mom of a junior in high school. As we make our college list, I am finding it very hard to identify small liberal arts colleges that not only tolerate but welcome diverse points of view within the classroom as well as on campus. My daughter's views could be described as center-right, but in this politically divided culture of ours, there have been many, many examples of students feeling pressure to say, quote unquote, the right thing, or being bullied and ostracized in some way if they express a point of view that is not deemed progressive enough. I am hoping that you can help identify some schools that still embrace the philosophy that they teach students how to think and not what to think. Thank you for all that you do.
Yeah, and I really liked this question. And so obviously you've heard the question, mom of a junior, California, she's center right, looking for schools that tolerate and welcome diverse viewpoints and concerned and in politically divided culture. Many, many examples of people feeling pressured to say the right thing, bullied if they don't have the correct views. So I'm going to start by saying some things. It'll be really transparent. Overall, in some ways, I'm very progressive in my politics. Some ways I'm moderate, some ways I'm conservative. But overall, I do lean more progressive, and I feel you guys have a right to know that. You can sometimes evaluate the things I say through that prism. I'm in a text message with my brother and Dave, and I'm definitely the most progressive one in there. They're always calling me names. And, I'd probably say someone like Ro Khanna from California is probably closest to my views. And I say that for two reasons. One, like I said, I do think people have a right to know the ideological lens through which I see things, examine what I say through that context and spirit of transparency. But having said that, I do want to acknowledge that even that I lean progressive, there is an intolerant left on college campuses. There's groupthink. There can be aggressive hostility to those with antithetical views. And young people lean left. Like I saw a more recent survey, 18 to 24, 65-31. So more than 2 to 1, lean left. And so it can be a little harder if you're more centrist. And that's the description I'm getting from Kristen here, center right, finding a campus, because what happens is, and this is just true in general on anything, but if a person senses their views are so much in the minority, then they tend to go undercover and don't bring them up. It's like message boards. I mean, how many times have you heard Lisa say, I don't even speak out on that message board because I don't want somebody to jump me?
Right.
Unfortunately, there's some of those in our college counseling world that we know about. I mean, that's a constant thing you'll hear. And that's what happens, the same thing. Well, if I'm going to get jumped, then I'm not even going to speak up. The problem with that is then all you hear is caricatures of the other side, and it doesn't actually develop your thinking the best as it could. And it's hard right now because there aren't as many of those center right voices. I know some. I work with families like that. But that is not necessarily the dominant theme in the Republican Party. It's kind of been hijacked with this personality cult and white grievance and replacement theory and owning the libs. So that engenders a backlash against it. And then that's people's stereotype. And then they get jumped because, if people associate the right with things like anti-Semitism, anti-immigration, book banning, anti-Asian, anti-women's freedom, whatever, inequality, then those are things people don't necessarily have tolerance for. So it creates a real conundrum. And what I find, so what's the answer? Well, there's definitely a strong correlation between the politics on a college campus and the politics in a state. It's not complete. So take your state, I'm going to start to cut my adopted state with 2 daughters there, but North Carolina. So we know North Carolina is purple, right? The last couple elections, it's been the closest state to swinging and went blue in 2008, and it's been barely gone red the last 3 or 4 elections. But then you have places like Guilford, UNC, Asheville, Warren, Wilson that are quite left. But in general, knowing that young people are 65-31 on college campuses, you generally have to be at something a little bit more right-leaning to get good Republican ballots. You just kind of do. So, for example, South Carolina, very conservative state. And you look at schools like Presbyterian and Wofford and Charleston Southern and Anderson. These states are quite right-leaning. Even a place like Furman, and I was recently there on the 11th of May, and I asked them their recent mock elections, and they're kind of 50-50. And so you really need, if you want to get more rightward views, you really need to be in a more politically conservative environment. That's my experience. Because even places like Alabama, like Tuscaloosa, University of Alabama, and Auburn, they went Democratic in the last election, and that's a plus 30 Republican state. Now, having said that, you also want to look even at specific districts within the state.
Right.
So let's look at Georgia. If you go into Marjorie Taylor Greene territory, that's Berry College, very conservative, probably more conservative than what Kristen's describing herself. But then if you go into blue areas, you get places like Agnes Scott, Spelman, Morehouse, Oglethorpe, Emory that lean liberal. And one way you can look at this is actually to look at the politics of the immediate area. And there's a couple good sources for that. One is city-data.com. It will give you like the political voting in the zip code. And another one that breaks it down even more detail is Politico. The website Politico, you can look up for any state how people voted in the 2020 election, and it breaks it down like by county. And you will tend to find correlation there between the immediate area and the politics of the school. So that's one thing. Another thing is just to ask students, ask admission officers. I like to ask them what were the results of your most recent mock election. And if they say, well, I don't know, then I would say, well, how would you, give me some conjecture. What would you say? That gives me a really good sense. I did that in almost all the schools at Tennessee. So if people are curious, Vanderbilt was 70-30, liberal. Sewanee was like 65-35, liberal. Belmont, very conservative. Lipscomb, very conservative. Carson Newman, very conservative. Getting that information, asking it in that way can give you a sense of that. You can also look at other things, like you can look at the course descriptions. You can look at the books that are read. You can look at the clubs that are on campus. But in general, if you just go standard of the road, highly selective liberal arts college in a blue state, you're not gonna find a ton of conservative voices. So those are some of my thoughts overall. What do you think, Lisa?
Well, I definitely understand Kristen's concern. I remember, I think I was just walking around Madison, Wisconsin with my kids one day. And like, I'm, like really pretty progressive and, coming from Illinois, and like, I'm a therapist, and we're all like, therapists are pretty much 95% vote Democratic. But like, I was getting some stink eye just walking around with kids. And I think people just, I found that interesting because, I don't view myself as any different ideologically from that population, but I didn't look like that population. And so, I mean, there's intolerance and prejudice on all sides of the equation. And I honestly feel like that, progressives who espouse that kind of thinking have alienated a lot of people in the center. And, maybe in part, like that's something that very extreme authoritarian candidates, they exploit that. And those people hate you. They don't like you. So I get that. I mean, it's a big problem. It goes beyond college. But I do think like really kind of just as much as they can visit places, that they've targeted using your methods, and really just kind of have their feet on the ground, see what the vibe is.
Yeah. I mean, this is real. Like, I have students that report this, that report the intolerance, report just getting jumped on at certain places. But I really find the places where that happens the most are blue states. But there are a lot of like, highly rated liberal arts schools in blue states. So I do think that's just a short, quick hand way of initially doing a screen.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you hone in on the exact location of the school, and then start reading newspapers. Like, newspapers will really give you a good insight too. Like, how do they cover certain things that are of interest to you, or, and see how the coverage is. Another idea is to look at the guest speakers that are brought to campus. I think you'll have a lot, like when I have students that really lean right, and I work with those students, I immediately know like certain states to look for schools for them. And it's going to be harder in bluer states. It just is. Now, you have to be a little careful because, like I said, Sewanee leans left. You might not look at that location and necessarily think that. But then sometimes some schools are pulling, their student bodies are being pulled a lot from all over the place. That's a factor as well that can play a role. But I think if you do some of these things, Kristen, I think you'll find success. And you're just looking for critical thinking. Now, I wouldn't say I'm aware of schools that lean right, that all of a sudden their critical thinking is better. I'm not aware of that. I just think that what naturally produces the better critical thinking is having students that have both sides that bring out the best views. So, case in point, I'm going to get into the weeds here, but a regular says, I'm into investing. So I really listened to this great debate on investing yesterday, and it had to do with stock compensation, whether stock compensation dilutes shareholders and is a negative thing, or whether stock compensation is a good thing because it helps companies retain their top talent, and it aligns the motivations of the employees with the motivations of the shareholders. It was a really good back and forth debate. And what made it so good was the two debaters both really believed what they said. So I was hearing like their best arguments.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's absolutely a shame that Kristen even has to ask this question. I think, as long as her student goes and respectfully expresses their ideas, and other people respectfully express theirs, and they can have an interesting conversation, and I mean, if you take out all of the, I don't know, the social aspects of politics right now, like the social issues. I mean, there is an argument to be made for a smaller government, and there's an argument to be made for a larger government, right? I mean, it's not cut and dry, and but everyone can learn things from other people who have differing viewpoints on that. And it's just a shame that we don't get to like express that. That doesn't seem like that gets that commonly discussed anymore before it goes into a screaming match.
Well, I mean, one of the things about college is it's a microcosm of society. So, like what you're talking about is happening in neighborhoods. It's happening everywhere. It's happening on airplanes where you can't even be what's the term? An airline attendant.
Flight attendant.
Flight attendant, especially during mass, like people getting in fights. So like if you've got this degree of contentiousness in the adult community over issues, a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times students adopt the views of their parents. And so college just becomes a microcosm. But in some ways, college inflames everything because you can't just go into your segregated enclave. And I'm not necessarily talking about segregation by race, but by ideology. Like, right, you could live in your community, in your home, away from everybody else, where your neighbors have your views, and you're in a school where people have your views, and you get to, now all of a sudden you're in a dorm room.
Right.
Now all of a sudden you're across the hall, you're living with people who think very differently than you've thought. You could always avoid people that might have dissimilar views to you before. Now you can't. And so it shouldn't be any surprise if adults have problems seeking unity across ideological lenses, and they can have all kinds of different tactics to distance themselves. Kids who have less facility, less experience, people's skills is not as well refined, and living in super close corridors. And that's why there's just so many questions in those college specific questions that get at, like, can you accept difference and function with difference and live in unity with difference? Because they know how divisive it is to have people that can't, and just create a whole learning environment that's not that's not positive and constructive. And I remember, this is going back a ways now, but it was like probably 6 or 7 years ago. I was talking with someone that does a lot of diversity work, and they were going to conferences with presidents, and they said a lot of people are just throwing up their arms, like leaderships, about how to handle this, because one person feels they have a right to free speech, and another person feels they have a right to wear their MAGA hat. And then it's like, how do you reconcile that? Well, I don't feel comfortable with what you're wearing. That's a symbol. And I feel this. And then how do, like all these kinds of things break out, and they're like, it might sound like simple, but they're not always simple to resolve.
Yeah. No, it's not simple at all. And I think like it's hard because I think like, why were the people in Madison giving me the stink eye? Because they felt that many of these people were trans or LGBTQ. They assumed that I was gonna, not like them. I was not gonna accept them, that I would vote against and of course none of that's true, but it's just because
Right.
I'm like a white looking mom, you know. But the same thing is true on the other side. And I think that's what Kristen's student is going to come across. Like if you have it's hard for people not to respond emotionally to a conservative idea if they're associating with, a group of people who go into Target and harass minimum wage workers because they don't like what the store's selling. And that's just it's asking a lot of humans. So on all sides, and I mean that's not Kristen's fault or her child's fault. It's just that's just is what it is right now.
Yeah. The other reason why I like it when you have a little bit more balanced ideology, and I'm personally not talking about MAGA, because MAGA to me is hate, it's discrimination. I'm talking about conservative right views that are non-MAGA.
Right, of course.
I need to say that because the MAGA mindset is the dominant mindset of the Republican Party right now, which is why Trump and DeSantis have over 70% of the votes in the polls, and everybody else is in single digits. Most of the center-left Republicans have left the party and become independents. So I can understand why Kristen feels so alone. It's a lonely road being a center-right non-MAGA Republican these days. So the other thing that's really good when you have that, not only does it bring out the best intellectual arguments to really develop your thinking, but the leadership feels it needs to serve its constituency, and its constituency has varied views. So it sort of holds the administration accountable to doing more balanced things because their constituency is more balanced, if that makes sense.
Right. No, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I wish that it was. I mean, I know, my family has several conservative thinkers in it. My brother and his
You're from
wife being
Missouri.
Well, I'm from Missouri, but my brother and I agree on like 95% of issues. And socially, he's very liberal, right? It's just more like fiscally, with taxes and business. And he's very pro business because he owns a
Sure.
business. But,
Sure.
we could talk about that. And it was for years we've debated that, and it's
Right.
fine.
Yeah.
But he doesn't feel like there's a place for him in society anymore, like someone with conservative views, but, is socially accepting. And I mean, I think the Republican Party is just, it's there's no place for conservatives like that anymore. So, who are, I think like not hateful people, where do they go? So I think that, maybe that's something that, Kristen's students' generation can address, is that there is a place for that. And like I said, it's an argument. There's not a right or wrong answer necessarily on a lot of these things.
Yeah, but I think as a parent, it's really important you find a safe space for your kid.
Oh, absolutely.
And I really like this question because I do think there's some views on the left that don't know how this left intolerance is a real thing.
Oh, it's absolutely 100% a real thing.
Yeah, like it's a real thing that I have my students experience and share it with me, and their parents share it with me. And intolerance on the other side is also a real thing.
And it absolutely is.
And so it's a good question. And on your College of My Kid, we try to grapple with real issues and not duck them and avoid them because, you're getting political, you're turning somebody off. Like, this is the real world. We're going to deal with it. So I don't know if we were helpful, Kristen, but thank you for your question. And
Yeah, good
I'd
luck.
love for you to follow up and see if any of our suggestions were helpful for you. Thank you.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, over the next 4 weeks, you're going to hear from Akil Bello, who's had a national platform now for several decades. He's both a test prep instructor and a fierce critic of the abuses and misuse of standardized testing. He's also the one who coined the term highly rejective colleges. But in my opinion, this is one of the better interviews I've done in our 6 years of Your College Bound Kid. And at times, his answers and insights are riveting. So we hope you'll tune in to all 4 parts. In part 1, Akil gives his backstory, walking us up to what he's doing now. He talks about the mission of FAIR Test, explain why the mission appealed to him. He explains what the new digital SAT is, and he shares the pros and cons of the new test. He explains his thoughts on whether it's a good thing that the digital SAT is an adaptive test. Akil explains the problem that he has with the College Board, and he shares his perspective on schools like MIT, Purdue, and Georgetown that are requiring test scores from their students. Listen and enjoy. Friends, really excited today. I'm here with Akil Bello. Hey, Akil, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Great. So, Akil, I'll let him introduce himself to you and give you a little bit about his backstory. But I've entitled this "Tough Questions About Test Scores," and we were joking around before we started. He's like, "You don't play around. A lot of people dance around the bush, but you don't play." But I appreciate the fact, sometimes I send questions in advance and people are like, "Can you kind of change this question and change that?" But he's like, "Hey, bring it on. I'm ready." So we're going to have some fun with this one. But Akil, why don't you give your backstory and anything you want to say, walk yourself all the way up to what you're doing now, just anything to help our listeners know the context from which you'll speak.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me first off. I guess the reason that I'm here is because I have a certain set of skills that I have developed over. No, I won't do the taken intro. But I've spent 30 years in and around testing and admissions. My first 11 years or so was doing everything you possibly can do in test prep at the Princeton Review, from tutoring and proctoring and training teachers to working in the office, developing questions, all of that sort of stuff. Then I went out for the next 11 years or so and ran my own test prep company. So again, doing kind of everything you did. That second phase was more focused on helping schools and CBOs develop programs to support their students through the admissions and testing journey. And I guess sort of this last phase of my career, which has been in part consulting, in part dabbling here and there, has been more about educational access, admissions policy, and testing policy writ large. So right now, I'm senior director at Fairtest, which is a nonprofit that works to advocate for more limited, more reasonable, more scientific use of admissions tests.
And yeah, that's awesome. We love Fair Test and just appreciate your work and having followed you over the years. So have you been New York based pretty much all your life, or have you moved around there as well?
Since my second year of college, I've been in New York. I was born in New York. I lived a whole bunch of places. Then I came back to New York my second year of college, and I've been here for the last going on 30 years now.
Awesome. Let's go back to Fair Test. You shared a little bit of, about what you do, but can you elaborate a little bit? Like, what are you hoping to accomplish in your Fair Test role?
So I guess the easiest way to describe it is testing in this country. Let me say that a little bit more clearly. Large scale standardized testing in this country is horrifically misused. And the goal of Fair Test since it started was to advocate for less egregious usage of test and interpretation of test results. So that fit very well with my personal beliefs and missions. As I spent at the time I joined Fair Test, was about 2-3 years ago. I spent a really long time teaching people how to get around the false hurdles these tests erect and the strange perceptions these tests create. And so I think that the work of Fair Test is to make people stop believing a lot of the BS that's believed about these tests.
Well, as soon as I saw you take that position, I thought it was a perfect match, because there's certain people that I feel know how to break glass when it comes to exposing the test, and to me, you're up there on the Mount Rushmore with people like people like Schaefer. I'd put him in there. Bockenstedt, I'd put him in there, who we've had on the podcast. So a collection of like minds coming together, which some good things can happen there. So listeners, this might seem a little disjointed, this interview, because this is kind of exciting for me. I literally sat down and I said, what are the questions that I've always really wanted to ask? And they're all over the place. So, it's like I'm not necessarily thematic. I'll jump around from topic to topic. And that's mostly what you're going to hear today. I did throw in probably 3 or 4 that I think our listeners may also be interested in. But don't be surprised if it feels very disjointed, but I think you're going to get a lot out of it. So let's first start out with the new digital SAT. Why don't you explain, in case any of our listeners don't know, what the new digital SAT is and how it's different from the old test? And I'd love your thoughts on what you see as sort of the pros of the test and any concerns you have about the test.
Sure. So the digital SAT is SAT version 22.0.
I know. It's been a lot just since
the product line.
It's been a lot just since the, I guess, 2005 2400 experiment. There's been a lot of models just since that one.
Yeah, I mean, it's the latest model, and the thing that gets me about it is College Board always comes out and tells you it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. All the tests before it were crap and we did bad things. And here's the new one, which somehow is not going to do any of the bad things that the last one did. So for parents, what they should recognize, if we sort of cut through the marketing BS coming from College Board, it is shorter. Like I like that it's shorter. Yep. You can't knock taking a 2-hour test instead of a 3-hour test.
Sure.
Right? Now, so there is that, and that part is one of the pros of the test, right? So it's a shorter test. It's a digital test, meaning it is delivered on computer-ish devices. You can do it on a tablet. You can do it on a laptop. You cannot do it on a phone, and you don't do it at your house, right? But it's a tablet or a laptop, so you can take it on computer, which has pros and cons, right? I still print out long emails. So, I think that that's going to take some getting used for kids who aren't used to doing tests on computer screens. But let's see. So the things that we need to know about it. It is an SAT that is on a computer. It is shorter than the older test was. It is also adaptive. So your performance on the first section impacts your performance on the second section. So anything you know about scoring of the test, anything you believe about scoring a test kind of goes out the window because the way the scoring works is entirely different. Okay, and that's sort of the most important change there.
And one other positive I would say would be immediate, you get your scores back faster.
So it's days, not weeks, is what they've said. That to me is also going to be one of those places where I'm a little concerned, because the way I'm understanding it right now, they're going to make you download an app in order for students to get their scores, but the app is also tied to student search.
Right. Yeah, we just talked about that. Connections, their new product they're rolling out.
Yeah, right.
Trying to recap the names they're losing now that they're not capturing as many names through search for various reasons. And actually, I just learned that it's against the law in a lot of states to purchase names if a school requires you to take the test. And of course, they're trying to move toward a lot of in-class school
right.
things. So
that's what the thing with the digital test is. Yes.
Yeah.
The new score delivery mechanism and the new search mechanism. So they're trying to play, and that's the big problem that I have with College Board, right? I don't know that I would say the SAT, it's a test of math and reading things, right? If we just stopped fully right there and said, this is a test of math and reading things, I would have far fewer problems with this. The problems start to come in when people say things like academic ability, college readiness, and they start to project it out like career readiness. Math and reading somehow is career readiness, and then College Board selling your name, your information, your scores, the ability to send your scores for the test you played for to the college of your choice may cost you $13. So all of the things surrounding it are so problematic, it makes the test itself hard to support, even for the small portions of things that might be supportable.
Let's go back to the adaptive test. What are your thoughts on that? Do you see that as a positive or negative? I've heard arguments both ways. I'd like to know your thoughts on it.
I think with every change, there's some people who like it and do well, some people who don't. So I reserve judgment on better. I think that it's an individual thing that people try to make broad judgments about entire groups. I lived through when the GMAT went adaptive 20 years ago, when the GRE went adaptive 20 years ago. There's always people who love it and people who hate it. I think that to a parent, all you need to know is, does my kid hate taking tests on computers and do I need to avoid this? Or do they love it and they're always on a screen and this is going to be better for them, especially because it's shorter, right? So I think that there's a policy consideration, and that's a little bit of what's going to happen with these questions, right? There's two different pieces of me that are going on here. The policy consideration and the practical sort of parent consideration of what do you need to do for your child right in this moment versus what's the educational system and testing system that should exist to be most effective and equitable.
Makes a lot of sense. I heard you say some comments about the College Board. Elaborate. What do you see as the pros and cons of the College Board?
I can't find very many pros. College Board corporation that pretends it is an education nonprofit out for children. That's the best way I can describe College Board. At every turn where there's an option, even if we think about score sends, right?
Sure.
They could have kept scores separate from the connections product. There is no reason to tie those two things together except for the potential financial benefit to the organization.
Right.
So at every decision point where they can say we can do what is in the interest of children separate from our profit, or we can do the thing that generates money for us, it's always the money path they seem to take. That's the biggest problem with College Board. And so they oversell what their products do and mean.
I appreciate how succinctly you said that.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
This is Linda with this week's recommended resource, the Common App for mobile. That's right, the Common App has an app for your phone, so you can access your account or create an account if you don't have one yet on the go. No more excuses. The app allows students to work on their college applications from wherever they are and whenever they want. They can stay on track with application deadlines, update their activities section, work on essays, invite recommenders, and even apply to schools via the app. The app integrates with the website, so any updates will appear in your student account regardless of the platform used. You can download the app in the Apple App Store or in Google Play. Learn more at commonapp.org/mobile.
I think that they have some good things. I would say. I think some people, for example, like Landscape, their product Landscape that helps.
Okay, but let's think about that.
Yeah.
Right? They built it. They started to roll it out to colleges. They got pushback from the conservatives when it was labeled adversity score.
Sure.
They haven't updated it since. They haven't touched it or marketed it since 2019 when they got the blowback and it was called adversity score. That is perfect, College Board. We're going to do something good that will largely help equity, that will benefit students, that we're not even selling. But if we can't get a PR benefit from it, oh no, let's just let that go away.
I don't disagree with you for the most part, but here's what there are a lot of college admission officers that find Landscape helpful.
I thought it was an amazing thing.
Reading a file and bringing that context in.
I sent them an invoice 2 weeks after the article came out in the Wall Street Journal. I didn't get a response, right? I sent them an invoice for all the time I spent defending and defining what Landscape actually was.
That's
because,
funny.
They let it, they flubbed the rollout.
Right.
This is the same thing they did with AP African American Studies.
Oh, yeah, I was about to say that's in the total flubbed rollout.
Right. It's a product that could have benefited underrepresented minority students, and they flubbed the rollout and let it become a political football. And they've done this over and over and over again, right? Like, who couldn't predict that if you take all this environmental context and boil it down to a score, that's not going to turn into a big mess? Like the first year intern could have told them, probably don't make this a score.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the arrogance of the organization.
And I'm sure you have a problem with probably Coleman's $2.7 million salary because it's on the backs of a lot of people that, the waivers, how hard it's been to get waivers. And some of that would be another example probably of doing what's in your best interest of profits versus students, right?
Yeah. How many, if we compare the salary of the president of this nonprofit educational organization with a mission to help children, blah, 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 with McKinsey, like with the worst of the profiteering for-profits you can think of, like it stacks up really well. That shouldn't be how, like, simply because of optics, that's a bad thing.
Sure.
But, they don't care.
Yeah, great points. I really appreciate your willingness to call it like it is, because I've actually attempted to go into the College Board in the past in some interviews, and some people have felt the need to be really guarded.
I have no, belief that they will ever hire me for a job. So, and I'm happy to be proven wrong on any of these things. I will also try to be clear about this is my opinion and perception of their actions. I don't talk to College Board. They don't tell me why they do things, but they also don't they didn't give any clear explanation for it. So all I have is my perception, right? But when you look at it, when David Coleman will come out and write a letter criticizing a teenager, praising the teenager for mentioning AP US history, and criticizing that teenager who just survived a mass shooting in her school, criticizing her for not being fair to the gun lobby. And yet that same person won't come out and criticize Amazon for using SAT scores to place their headquarters. Because College Board has a document that specifically says, these are the things you don't use scores for. So there's a big public push that Amazon is using SAT scores to place headquarters too. College Board won't comment on that. But when it's in their interest to say, oh, look, you mentioned AP US history, teenager who just survived a shooting in your school, like this is something he needs to comment on. Like, what else does that motivate except profit or desire to be, perceived a certain way? It's a very bizarre thing.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you're saying from a motive standpoint. I probably give them a little more credit for doing some good. Like, I think a website like Big Future
which they've ruined. Come on. Wait, Revs of Big Future 5 years ago and Big Future today, which would you rather have?
Yeah, but I still think that helps people. I still think
Like,
people get some
how?
value from it.
Sure. Like, I think what's fascinating, right? Like, and
I'm not
you're
here to defend the
trying
college
to
board,
be
Akil.
kind.
I'm
You're
just
trying to
trying.
be kind.
No, I'm just trying.
Do
Go
you
ahead.
use Big Future to search for colleges, or do you find other places that have better information or information arranged in a more useful way?
I mean, I don't use it because there's lots of other
Okay,
sources out there. But
okay, right? I actually was just ranting about it on Twitter because I used to love it.
Mhm.
And then they updated it and turned it into basically marketing trash.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of marketing there. There's no, I can't dispute it. And it's hard to you do see the profit motive around almost every corner. I will say this: there are some good people I know that work there that I believe have kids' best interests in heart. I've gotten to know them, and admissions people. So, I try to see the mix in
Right.
in
That's why,
everything.
like, other than Coleman, I reserve naming names,
Hmm.
right? Because, like, you can see his fingerprints on lots of things. I don't dispute that. It's if they offered me enough money, I might work there. Like, I don't dispute,
Well,
we all have
I
bills
know
to
their
pay.
salaries are quite generous.
Like, I'm sure there's a salary and a position they could find that would make me shut up for a very long time.
Well, at least you're honest.
We all have bills to
There's a
pay.
saying, everybody's got a price. I guess you
Right.
proved it.
Right. It's like, hey, listen, there's a number. I'm not too stupid to say, somebody comes like, you can make $9 million a year. It's like, sure. As long as I don't have to assassinate anybody, let's go.
Well, let's transition to another controversial topic. So, as you know, several schools have rejected test optional and said we need either we need scores or we want scores or we see values to scores. The argument basically being that scores plus grades is a better predictor of academic performance than just grades. And I'm talking about, for example, Georgetown, MIT, Purdue. Let's just name those three because we know there's state systems like Tennessee and Florida, but that's a different thing. This thing's being done on an institutional level. So these schools say their research indicates requiring scores is worth all the advantages of being test optional. So do you look at that and say that's a justifiable position? They've got their own research. Who am I to say what their research is? Or do you look at that and say that's a bunch of malarkey?
I look at the research to see if the statements and the research align. I actually wrote an article for the Chronicle of Higher Ed about MIT. I found MIT's statement bizarre, right? MIT claims they have 20 odd years of research that supports the use of tests, which they're not going to share with us.
Mm-hmm.
That seems very strange to cite this research, yet to keep it private, also knowing that MIT admits students from within about an 80-point score range. How can that be? Like, I am literally really fascinated. I would love to be proven wrong, to show me how that narrow a score range, especially in math, where it's like 20 points different, is
Sure.
actually demonstrative of any performance in the college, right? Especially knowing, like, it would have
Sure.
been one thing if, like, the SAT had, like, calculus on it, but it doesn't. And MIT's statement was actually fascinating. It said something like, we're not quite sure why this says anything, but it does, right?
Right.
I like the honesty of we're not sure why the hell this is meaningful. In essence, they said we like it long and hard, right? It's a long, hard test, and therefore it must be representative of the work that we do at MIT. So, like, there's things like that are strange, that seem more conjecture than actually data driven.
Well, I can't say who this came from, but I had a really lengthy conversation with an MIT competitor, and they were very, very cynical of that statement. First of all, we know this common data set indicates they take 0 kids with under a 700 math, right? That's the point you're taking. So,
Yep.
So one of the things this individual said to me was, I would love to see their research because we admit the same kids they admit. And they said, you know what the research might show for us? That maybe if we take somebody a little lower, maybe they have a 3.2 instead of a 3.4. Wouldn't you want a great kid with a
Right.
3-2 instead of a 3-4 on your campus?
And that is so that's my contention, right? One is it's like their statement was bizarre. The refusal to release data was bizarre. But it's funny because like MIT would be the place that I would be fully in support of them saying, we actually kind of don't care. It's hard to do work here. We want y'all to jump through all the hoops, and this is a mathy hoop. This is a mathy place. Jump through it. Like, I would respect that as a statement. We want it. We choose to do it. It's my house. I play how I want to. Right? Like, it's like, fine, do what you want to do, right? But to make the statement of we're doing it to increase diversity, which is probably mathematically impossible.
Yeah.
Right, based on simply how people
They did come out and
scores
say
play
that.
out. Right.
They
Like,
basically said that when you get a really high scoring kid, then you know that kid is unique and special and blah, 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 and it can help diversity. And I heard them make that case. Yeah.
right. Like all of that is bizarre and damaging in many ways to the system at large, right? So I have issues with the statements themselves. I cannot contest their research because I haven't seen it. But I also find it bizarre that I haven't seen it.
Friends, this concludes the first part of my interview with Akil Bello. I hope you'll join us next week for part 2.
And now it's time for our college spotlight of the week.
Friends, I'm here with Lisa, and Lisa's going international on us. So
That's right.
You heard all about my trip to Tennessee, or at least a little bit about my trip. And when I was in Tennessee, Lisa was at McGill in Montreal fighting fires, Canadian fires. So,
well, the ironic thing about that is, when I was in Canada, I couldn't understand why everyone was texting me, asking me if I was okay, because the air was as clear as a bell because it was all going south. Right. So,
Right.
I mean, I didn't even know wasn't even aware that was happening
Wow.
for a while. So that's kind of the ironic thing about that.
And that's still happening because I just talked to a Chicago
Yeah.
family who told me how bad it was. And so this would have been what for you, Lisa? Like around June?
This was
6th,
June
7th, 8th? June 5th. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Good stuff. So Lisa's going to tell us about McGill, which I'm really excited. So take it where you want to go, Lisa.
All right. Well, McGill is one of the premier universities in Canada and is located, as Mark mentioned, in Montreal, Canada, which is in the province of Quebec. It is English speaking. It's one of the only English speaking universities in Quebec. I think there's a couple more, but a lot of the other ones are French speaking. McGill has been around for a while. It was founded in 1821 by a man named McGill, and he was quite rich, but he was also sick. And so he really wanted doctors to cure him, but there weren't any doctors around. So he threw his money in and created a medical school to try to help find a cure. But unfortunately, he died himself before they could cure him. But however, it did start this great tradition of medicine, and I'm sure his legacy is that he has helped many other people regain their health. It's huge. It's 40,000 students, and there's also a ton of majors, like 300 majors. And at McGill, like the classes can get pretty big. The biggest auditorium holds 607 students, and they will pack it so that everyone, like there's not an empty seat in the house for some of the introductory classes. McGill has kind of a different system of application than many American universities. Apparently, in Canada, a lot of students before they go to university do like a year or two, basically what we would call like a community college. So they come in with some college credit. So if you're an American high school student and you don't have any APs, you have to apply as year 0. And if you're a year 0, then you don't have to pick a major, but you do have to apply to what they call the faculty, which is what we would call like the school, like the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, the Faculty of Engineering, the Faculty of Business. And if you do have APs, if you have a 30 AP credits, then you can apply as a year 1, but then you have to apply to a specific major. So it's not just going into the school, but a specific major. And it's good to be pretty certain that you want to study that major, because it's hard to change majors, especially changing majors into things like business, medicine, or engineering. You can change out of those majors and go into the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, which is in fact what our tour guide did. He started out in the Faculty of Business, and now he is an African Studies major. So his dad was not happy with him, but he loves what he does. But it's you can't go the other way. So you can't start out being an African Studies major and decide you want to be in mechanical engineering. You will have to go someplace else or reapply. And it's just like a really big school. And so you only live on campus for the first year. So there's a lottery where you get your residences, and there are traditional dorms, and then there are suite style residences for first years. And some of the dorms they all have reputations, and some of the dorms are known as the party dorms. And so people will either prioritize that on their housing application or deprioritize that according to their needs. There's a couple places which are like the quiet places to live. So in McGill's built on a hill. So if you go to McGill, you're going to get really good at walking up hills because you'll have to walk up hills to go to class. So some of the housing is at the top of the hill and some of the housing is at the bottom of the hill, which to me, that would make a difference. I don't know. It just depends. Do you want to walk up in the morning or in the evening? What your energy level is. And so basically with McGill, everything is pretty competitive is what our tour guide told us. So classes are competitive. If you want an internship or a research opportunity, they're very competitive because there's so many students there. And so, he said that if you are going to be a successful student at McGill, you must prioritize making relationships with your teaching assistants and the professors. And if you do that they will help you. But networking is everything. And it's not sort of like in some American schools where they're kind of gently encouraging you. If you don't do it, you don't do it. No one comes and gets you. But if you don't do it, you are going to maybe not succeed as well there. I should have said that what happens when you live, where do you live after year one? You rent an apartment. And students either live close by, so right within like a few blocks of campus, or in like the kind of fun, artsy area of Madrid called Plateau Royal. And that the rent is around 800 to 1,200 Canadian per month. So McGill has 3 big campuses. The first one is the big one that I mentioned that's on the hill, and that's in the middle of downtown Montreal. Then they have a medical campus where they have their medical school and stuff, and that's in another area in the city. And then they have a suburban campus that's near the airport called the McDonald campus, and that primarily focuses on biology and ecology. And that's like more of what we'd say is like a traditional American style campus. The buildings on the big campus, some of them are beautiful and old. Some of them are modern and ugly, in my opinion, like the brutalist. I am not a fan of the brutalist school of architecture, ladies and gentlemen. And so, so it's a real mix of, you can tell the schools had very different times where they've built in very different styles. But it's all together. The other thing about living at McGill is it's super cold. And they don't have a snow day around there. Like classes happen no matter what. And our guide advised us that he recommends you have to spend at least $1,500 a year on winter clothing to survive. Otherwise, but McGill students kind of pride themselves on their ability to survive in the winter. And one of the things that, that they talk about a lot is we're warriors. We're warriors here. If you come here, you have to be a warrior. You have to survive the dark. You have to figure out how to get to class when, because not only just snow, but ice. And imagine you're trying to walk even from the subway and it's like just sheets of ice. So you have to you have to want it. If you're that kind of kid who it's raining and you're like, I think I'll go back to bed, this might be hard for you to make it through school. And the other thing about life there is that the kids feel really safe in the city. And I think Montreal is a really safe city. I didn't walk around at 3 a.m. by myself because I'm usually asleep by then, but I absolutely could have, and it would have been fine. And the school is very progressive, as is the city of Montreal. So, and again, it's kind of like a work hard, play hard kind of atmosphere, but there's no Greek life. So you won't have fraternities and sororities. And I really did not get a sense of how well attended the sports were.
Not like US, I can tell you that.
No, I mean, it's like, I went to this school and then I went to East Carolina, I'm sorry. And at East Carolina, they showed us the football, stadium, and they took us up to show us the chancellor's box at the football stadium. I didn't even see a stadium.
No.
Don't even mention sports at McGill.
And that a lot of Canadian schools are that way, by the way. It's more the norm than the exception.
Right. So in terms of life there, he said that, the grading is really hard. He felt like our tour guide that a good GPA would be at least a 3.7, but to get that, you really have to devote yourself. However, if you do fail a test, you get less than 35% on it, you can take that test to the ice cream shop on campus and they'll give you a free sundae. So that is something else, that you can do. The great majors there, I mean, I think they're all really rigorous. It was kind of hard to find like what's the good major here, because they're all good, but engineering, medicine, and business and economics seem to be the ones that I have heard have risen to the top.
All right, I have to have a fun fact story. So,
fun fact, people.
Yeah, so I don't know if you know this, Lisa, but my dad was born in Montreal.
You mentioned that, I think, just recently.
So he actually left the province because they weren't hiring Black teachers, like, more discrimination stuff. So that's what led him to move to Ontario. So I would go back there mostly just because we had to visit grandma, and his grandmother lived to be 107. She lived 1 month from being 108.
That's fabulous.
Yeah, she bowled at 100, so she's all over TV. But the fun fact is, our regular listeners know Dave and I have this really long friendship. Well, it goes back to the fact that our dads were best friends. And so how did they meet? Well, Dave's dad came from Tobago to go to McGill for medical school. And they attended this, and then he attended the same church as my dad. And so that's how they really met. Dave was actually born in Montreal.
Oh,
yeah.
So it all kind of comes together.
Yeah, it all comes together. And then our listeners just hear about Dave, but I'm actually super close to his two brothers too, Andrew and Michael. And of course, my brother Norman, all of us are. And his brother, Michael's son, Ethan, is at McGill. And he'll often, Dave and I will talk a lot. And the grading is pretty brutal. Like, you comment on that. Like, it's one of these, it's hard not, it's a very prestigious school, like nationally renowned school, arguably Canada's most prestigious school, but it's a world renowned school. Like the University of Toronto people and maybe UBC, they might push back on that, that question. But it is way easier to get in than it is to like excel. Like 3.7 would be a really high GPA there. Like, it's really common to get C's.
Yeah. So
people have to adjust to that. That's one thing for Americans. They have to adjust. And the University of Toronto's the same way. Like, they grade really tough, especially in the sciences.
Well, even like their grading scale, that's intimidating. So, I mean, it is hard to do well there.
And I don't know, you mentioned the community. I don't get back very often since I left. I left in the early 80s, but when I was in Canada, they had a grade 13.
Yeah.
So you would graduate, you would actually have a high school graduation after grade 12, and you could go to college after that if you want it, or you could stay an extra year. Dave and I both stayed that extra year, and then we got like crazy college credit for it. I've heard they've changed it a lot, or at least maybe done away with it back where in Ontario. But I'm wondering if that extra year is that grade 13, because I know that we had it when I was there, and it wasn't community college. It was actually done in your high school.
Part of their school.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we went on a walking tour of old Montreal. And so we had a tour guide, and she, grew up in Montreal, had her daughter, and her daughter went to McGill. She went to McGill. And I think she said many kids do 2 years of that, whatever it's called, grade 13, because I was commenting about how like much more independent students at McGill are expected to be than American college freshmen. She's like, yeah, because they're 20, so we don't, they've already been babied a little bit, before they got on the scene so that they could develop in the way that they needed to.
I think that's part of it, but it's just the overall Canadian system. There's not all the coddling and not all the orientation. And like, you have to be ready to go live independently in the middle of the city. And Toronto and UBC and other cities are the same way. And that's one of the questions I always ask for somebody looking at those schools. Like, can you handle the level of independence that's expected?
Right.
And, some people can. But, I say the same thing to people about NYU also.
Right. Well, that is true. That is absolutely true. And just as a distinction, this school is much less expensive than NYU because it's
Yes.
going to run you around $31,000 US is the cost of attendance.
Although Canada does that differential tuition. So like the School of Commerce, like you look at pricing for School of
Right,
Commerce,
that's
it's like
true.
drastically higher. Like I've seen it be 75 all in if you take the most expensive college. But what I will say is a lot of these, even the leading Canadian schools, the UBCs, the U of Ts, the McGills, Americans get merit money. And so like between exchange on the dollar and merit money, and like you said, if you're not in one of the more expensive majors, they really can be bargains, which is the point you're making.
And you can't always count on it, of course. But right now, the exchange rate was pretty strong.
And it's been that way for quite a while now. Like it started, even when I was at Michigan State, it was bad. And then you're right, it has ebbed and flowed, but it's kind of been about 30% for a while.
Yeah. In terms of the student body, it's a very diverse student body, and 50% of the students are from Quebec, 25% is from the rest of Canada, and 25% is international. And the U.S. is a part of that, but it is by no means the only country where students are coming from. They're coming from all over the world. So you will get to know a lot of people from a lot of different cultures if you go there.
Friends, hopefully you enjoyed the first part of Lisa's breakdown of her visit to McGill. Hope you join us next week for the final part. Friends, on Monday's episode, we will resume. That's right, we'll resume Lisa and Susan answering a question about help for students with special needs. And then Lisa and Dr. Irina Smith will continue with the final part of the interview about her book, The Golden Ticket, A Life in College Admission Essays. And friends, I promised you a few weeks ago that I would include a quote from my book for 10 weeks in a row. So I wrote this book called 171 Answers to the Most Asked College Admissions Questions in 2016 and 17. It's up on Amazon if anybody's interested. But at the start of the book, I have these quotes, and they're just some of the most impactful quotes that really touched me. And I want to share another one today, and it simply says this: I actually thought that at times at Stanford, that having a perfect SAT hurt you. Did you catch that? I actually thought at times at Stanford, having a perfect SAT hurt you. It represented a commitment to a standardized test that we really didn't think measured much. And that's Martin Walsh, former Assistant Dean of Admissions at Stanford. See you on Monday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.